Welcome everyone to Drisha's full programming and the fourth part of the 7-part session course on the origins of academic Jewish studies by Dr. Chanan Gafni. As always, we encourage you to ask questions either by unmuting yourself or by putting questions in the chat on Zoom or by commenting on Facebook. We value your active participation. And now without further ado, I'll turn this to Dr. Gafni.
Thank you so much. I'm happy you made some time. I understand you have a busy day there in the States. And nevertheless, you made an effort to come. Okay, so what we're going to do today, we're going to continue the second part of this mini-series. In the first part of the series, we were trying to talk about the theoretical aspects of modern Jewish studies. We're talking about the meaning or the significance of critical studies. We're talking about the ideology that accompanied those studies. We were talking about the institutions and so on. And in the second part of the series, we're trying to explore how did this actually happen for real, or look at the sources, look at the studies that were accomplishments of the 19th century and see what we can learn from that. If you remember, so we started here I'm sharing my screen. So we were trying to explain in the opening sessions what was so unique about or why do we look at critical studies in a different way than traditional studies. And we were talking about 4 important components. We were speaking about the time aspect, understanding that there's a time factor when we view Judaism. It's not a static phenomena, but rather something that changes over time. We spoke about the variety of forms, of shapes that Judaism appears in. We spoke about the context in which Judaism operates, and we spoke about raising questions or being more skeptical about the sources. And we said that in each one of the sessions in the second part of the series, we will look into one of those themes. So in the previous session, we were focusing on the time component, or on the time aspect. We were studying or discussing the oral law, and we saw that for the first time, people in the modern times were looking at oral law not as something that allows us to maintain the tradition in the most accurate way, but rather this is the platform that allows changes. So here we see how the time factor starts playing an important role in the way people look at Judaism, but also we saw that it's very much related to the 19th century ideologies of certain rabbis and certain camps in modern Judaism that were also eager to show that there is actually justification for changes in Jewish laws or Jewish practices, since this was something that always existed in Jewish history or the Jewish tradition. Today, we're going to talk about the second element in the critical way of viewing Judaism. That's the variety aspect, understanding that Judaism is not just one thing, that there's actually many voices or many sounds that are all part of Judaism, and you can't just focus on one form or one source or one approach, but rather accept the fact that there are many, many alternative ways of looking at things. So this is going to be the theme we're going to discuss today. And in the following sessions, we'll talk about context and about being more skeptical towards the sources. So let's start with today's. So this is the beginning of today's class. Now we're officially starting. We'll start with the traditional perspective. Usually when we think about our tradition from this type of perspective, we tend to think, or traditional people tend to think, that there's actually a set important authorities or rabbis that are really the ones who are responsible for the transmission of our tradition. And we have this change of transmission, and we traditional people tend to think this is the official form or shape of Judaism. If we speak one source that perhaps reflects this approach is the opening Mishnah in Masechet Avot. I'll read it first in Hebrew, and if one of you wants to read it in English, you're very welcome. In Hebrew, it reads, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai, umesara liYoshua, v'Yoshua lizkenim, uzkenim leNevi'im, uNevi'im mesarua leAnshe Knesset HaGdola. If somebody wants to read it in English, anybody?
I can handle this one.
Yeah, this is an easy one. Okay.
All right, so should I just read the English?
Yeah, just the beginning of the English, just to make sure that everybody's following.
Okay, Moses received the Torah from Sinai and gave it over to Joshua. Joshua gave it over to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets gave it over to the men of the great assembly.
We can stop here. So you see, the sense you get when you read this Mishnah is that there's one body or one form of an authority in which the tradition goes from generation to generation. So it starts with Moses, Joshua, elders, prophets, and then it would go on to the Tanaim and the Amoraim. Also, when people think about it from a traditional perspective, that's also how they view the texts. We know that there are different, the tradition is recorded in different compositions or books. And from the traditional perspective, people would want to think about it as follows. We have the 24 books of the Bible, which are what we call the Masoretic Canon. Then we have, if we're trying to think about the closest form of interpretation that the Bible has, so we think about its translations. We have the official authorized Targumim or translation, the Aramaic translation of Onkelos. We'll go on and we'll talk about the Midrash, and we'll tend to think about Midrashim, which are the interpretations of the Bible. And usually we will think about interpretations that are rooted in the school of Rabbi Akiva. Later on, it moves and we have a legal codex. And here too, we tend to focus on the Mishnah, which is the official, most important legal codex in Jewish tradition. And then we move on to its interpretation, which is recorded in the Babylonian Talmud. So that's how traditional people want to think about their tradition. One set of authorities and also one clear literary way in which it transforms from generation to generation. However, from the critical perspective, things are much more complicated. And this is indeed one of the most important things that modern Jewish studies brings forth, because modern scholars or critical scholars were eager to show that there's actually a lot more going on. And what we think or what we're exposed to is really just one pattern or one form of this phenomena, but there are actually many, many alternative voices or sounds that are recorded elsewhere. And this is true with regards to every generation. When we think about the Bible itself, so there's not just the Masoretic Canon that has its 24 books, but there are actually additional biblical texts that existed once upon a time as part of this Jewish tradition. Translations, there's not just Targum Onkelos, which was perceived as the official translations, but there are additional Aramaic and even Greek translations. And everything I'm talking about today is Jewish sources. I'm not referring to anything non-Jewish, even within Judaism. Also, when it comes to the translation, we don't have just one translation, one Aramaic official translation called Onkelos, but we have numerous translations that are also a form of interpretation, although they're not as known. Pseudo-Jonathan is one Aramaic translation. The Septuagint, which is the official Greek translation of the Bible. Midrashim, the Midrash, the interpretations that accompany the text. We don't just have the school of Rabbi Akiva, but there are also alternative schools or opposing schools, such as the school of Rabbi Ishmael. And this is not even to mention, yeah, I see somebody's asking something. Okay, it's not to me, okay. And in addition, we even have sources that are not even part of the rabbinic world, what we call Jewish Hellenistic literature. In other words, there are many, many additional Jews who interpreted the Bible or approached the texts and had their own contributions. The most famous ones are Josephus or Philo, but we're talking about numerous scholars that are also operating out there. When it comes later on to the Mishnah, the legal codex, it's not the only legal codex. There's an additional legal codex. And finally, there's not just one Talmud, there are actually two versions of the Talmud. There's the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud. Now, I'm not trying to say that traditional people are not familiar with the Palestinian Talmud or the Tosefta. Obviously, people acknowledge that there are additional texts. They were aware of those texts, but they certainly wanted to think that the main form of the tradition is recorded in the blue part of this slide. And the additional sources, they would consult or look into those texts only as something that, as a supplementary text. But certain texts, such as the Apocrypha, Septuagint, or Jewish and Hellenistic literature, they were not even counted as part of the tradition. People were not familiar with these texts, not to mention that they didn't trust them or take them seriously. One of the most important contributions of modern Jewish studies is the ability to look into a wider range of sources, to understand that there are many, many more forms of or shapes that the Jewish tradition that you can look into the Jewish tradition. It appears in more texts, and there are more authorities involved out there. What we're going to do today is just look into one story. We're not going to go through the entire tradition and try to see how people find, look into Jewish Hellenistic literature, Tosefta, Palestinian Talmud. That will be too much for today. So we're just going to take one example, one story, and that's going to be the story of the Apocrypha. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. So in today's class, we will learn two things. First, and the major part of today's class will be devoted to the basic discovery, the new discovery of the 19th century, or end of 18th, mainly 19th century, that there are actually additional compositions that belong to the same biblical period or to the Bible that were not familiar to most Jewish source scholars. And an additional thing, we'll talk about how did people handle the fact that in those sources, sometimes you encounter traditions that in some way or another can contradict or reflect alternative ideas that Jews were not familiar with. So this is what we're going to talk about today, the discovery of the Apocrypha and its impact on modern Jewish studies. But you should take this again as just one sample, one case study that shows what happens when people start, widening their horizons and looking into so many more texts and becoming familiar with so many more books that they haven't been familiar with. So this is the way the class will go. Okay, I want to see if this is for me. Yeah, so obviously you're mentioning also Megillat Ta'anit, Seder Olam. It's 100% true. This is David, right? And obviously I'm not referring here to every source that became familiar in the 19th century. I'm referring to the most important type of text. But Megillat Ta'anit actually appears within the rabbinic literature as well. So in that sense, it's not a new discovery. But the Apocrypha, for instance, or later on the Jewish Hellenistic literature, were texts that were totally unknown to many, many scholars up to the modern period. So let's start with our journey, today's journey. And this is what we're going to do today. First, we're going to talk about the definition. What is exactly the Apocrypha? We'll try to define this body of literature. We'll talk about the status of the Apocrypha in the Jewish tradition in earlier times, in the ancient period and in the medieval period. We'll talk about the discovery of the Apocrypha in the 16th and 17th century, where this process starts, the early signs of the Apocrypha in Jewish literature. Finally, we'll talk about the revival, and I will explain what I mean by that, of the Apocrypha in the 18th and 19th centuries. We'll talk about the end of this story, the happy end. Is it a happy end? You'll have to wait for that. And finally, we'll also talk about the dilemma that this discovery led to. Finally, people encounter non-rabbinic law or non-traditional Judaism. What do we do with that? How do we handle such things? Okay, so you're ready? I hope you are. Now we're starting. Okay. So let's start with the first question. What's the Apocrypha? Anybody wants to give us a definition? In Hebrew, people refer to the Apocrypha sometimes as Sfarim Chitzoniyim. Bachutz is to be left out, so the external books. But what does that mean? So how would we define, what is the Apocrypha? I'm sure you came across this term. What is that?
Is it the books that didn't make it into the codified Bible?
Okay, so this is usually what people start by saying, books that didn't make it to the Bible. But if that was true, this definition is right, but it's a bit too wide because we can't count every book that didn't make it into the Bible as Apocrypha. We still need to narrow down this definition because that would mean any book that existed in antiquity would be part of the Apocrypha. So we have to say something also positive about it, not just that it was not included in the Bible, but rather what? Okay, so the Apocrypha here, I'll show you the next slide. Here. So the Apocrypha, or let's put it this way, in ancient Judaism, in different communities, there were different versions of the Bible. Some versions were smaller, and some communities believed that there are more books that were held divine or that were held part of the Jewish Bible. In Egypt, they had one type of Bible that included more books, and in Palestine, they had fewer books. in ancient Judaism, different communities had different canons or different versions of the Bible. Some were larger canons and some were smaller canons. Modern Jews nowadays, Orthodox, but not just conservative, any form of Judaism, we follow what we call the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is what we refer to as the current Bible. And this is the Bible. In our the current version of the Bible includes 24 books. We have 24 books, the Torah, the law, prophets, and writings. However, other books that were not part of the Masoretic text, but nevertheless were counted as part of the Bibles in other communities, are called the Apocrypha. Okay, so the Apocrypha are books that were perceived or were counted as part of the Bible, but just didn't make it to what became later on the authorized version of the Masoretic text, which we consider nowadays as the authoritative version of the Bible. Where did these books survive? How did they survive then? They were included in an alternative canon of the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Bible composed in Egypt. And when this translation of the Bible was composed, it included more compositions or more books, in addition to the 24 books that are part of the current Jewish version of the Bible. Yes, Chaya, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I just didn't catch, just to clarify, the Apocrypha was once part of the canon, but just isn't part of the modern canon?
No, I wouldn't say it was once part of the canon. I would say that certain communities viewed more books than the current 24 books as part of their Bible. I wouldn't say that there was an authorized larger version of the Bible that was just narrowed down. I would say in each community, people had a different idea what should be considered as part of the Holy Scripture of the Bible. And in certain communities, they had more books than those 24 books that made it into the Masoretic text. The books that were included in the Greek translation of the Bible, but nevertheless didn't make it to the Masoretic text, are called the Apocrypha.
Question.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes.
With the at the time of the Septuagint translation, was this before the Masoretic text had been accumulated as being the official Bible or the something of that sort? So that
probably
the 70 scholars all brought their own to the translating.
No, so the answer is the Septuagint was formed before the Masoretic text became the only authoritative version of the Bible. It was probably 200 years BCE, whereas the Masoretic text in its current form was probably something that was only composed or set in the 1st century CE.
Okay, thank you.
Okay?
That kind of explains a lot.
I think Dr. Gafni is frozen again. In the meantime, I don't know if Dr. Gafni can hear me. I'll read some of the questions that we have. Are Ben Sirah and, forgive me for pronunciation, Enoch, part of the Apocrypha? Yeah, okay. I read some of the questions. You were frozen for a moment, so I figured I'll read the questions.
You hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly now, yes. Okay,
so yes. On the slide here, you can see the entire list of all the Apocrypha. We're talking about, it depends how you count those books. Some books sometimes are counted together. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these books. You heard of the book of the Maccabees, for instance, where we have the story of Hanukkah. That's part of the Apocrypha. It's part of the Septuagint, so it was considered part of the Bible in some communities, but not in the. What I wanted to say is that many of the books that you're familiar with, such as the book of Maccabees or Ben Sirah, were part of the Septuagint, but they just didn't make it into the Masoretic text. They were left out. So they are part of the Apocrypha. You have the entire list of those books here on the chart. So you can see, I'm sure you're familiar again with some of these books. Okay, you hear me?
We can hear you so far.
Okay, good. So what I was starting to say is that we're trying to define, we just started defining what are the Apocrypha, what do we call the Apocrypha or the additional biblical texts. And what we want to talk about now is their history. What did people know about these books? Oh, somebody was asking me beforehand about the idea of the rest of Esther. Who was asking me about that?
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about this too much, but you should know that this is actually a fascinating story. We have an alternative version of the book of Esther in which there are 7 assertions that you're supposed to add into the book. Isn't that amazing? That's part of the Apocrypha. Additional stories, dreams, letters that you're supposed to insert in different places in the Megillah, in the scroll of Esther. So when Purim comes, we can devote a session to that. It's a fascinating text, but there are many, many other fascinating texts that are part of the Apocrypha. This is, again, a theme for an entire semester. So what was the story? What was the history of the Apocrypha? So as I said before, in certain communities, they were considered as part of the Bible. Nevertheless, among the official rabbinic Judaism, they were left out. Here we're moving on to the next slide. You remember the verse we read last week in Kohelet, in the book of Kohelet, where it reads, "V'yoter mehem abni zaher, asot sfarim harbe en ketz." That's source number 1. In English, it reads, "And further by thee, my son, be admonished, of making many books, there's no end." So the Bible is mentioning here, or speaking negatively of having too many books, and the rabbis say, with regards to this verse, anyone who brings into their home more than 24 books brings a riot or tragedy into their homes. So you see, the rabbis were very concerned about enlarging the Bible, and they allowed only 24 books, the current Masoretic text. Everything else was considered something that was not allowed, was prohibited. Only 24 books and not more. By the way, you see that this is a play on of the word mehema. Mehema in Hebrew means of those. You see, you should not. And further, by thee, my son, be admonished, of making books, there's no end. So the word mehema means by these. Nevertheless, the rabbis read the word mehema as mehuma, or a riot. So when you have more than 24 books, you're bringing a riot into your home. That's one indication the rabbis are leaving these books out. Also in the Mishnah, in Tractate Sanhedrin 10a, it says, Rabbi Akiva says, Elu she'en laim chelek la'olam haba. The following people do not have the share in the world to come. And one of them is, Rabbi Akiva says, Af hakoreh besfarim chitzonim, somebody who reads heretical books or external books in Hebrew. So the rabbis only allowed 24 books, nothing beyond that. We already see this very clearly in rabbinic literature. When we move on to the medieval period, what is interesting is that most Jews were probably already not familiar with these books. Not just that they didn't allow those books, they just didn't know that they ever existed. Let's assume if we asked Rashi in the 11th, 12th century, did you ever hear about the book of Maccabees? What would Rashi answer? Probably. You can tell from the way I'm asking my questions.
No.
No, he never heard about it. So he didn't know who Judah the Maccabee was. He didn't know the story of Hanukkah the way we know the story of Hanukkah, because he never read those books in his lifetime. He didn't know of many, many other stories that became very well known by now, but these people were just not familiar with that. I'm not saying that you won't find a single reference to these books in Jewish literature in the medieval period. Obviously, you will find some here and there, but certainly
Were some of these books more common among Christian scholars?
Excellent, excellent, excellent. We'll talk about this.
Because I know painters painted pictures of the story of Susanna or
Excellent.
Judith.
We're going to talk about this in a
Like
second.
that.
Excellent. So it's a very good question. So, but Jews were not familiar with these texts here. You see, I'm looking here in another slide. These are just two rabbis who are making clear you should not look into any book in addition to the 24 books. Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra says in one of his interpretations, Klal Omar Lecha, I'll give you a rule. I'll give you a general rule. Kol sefer shelo ktavuhu nev'im o chachamim mipi HaKabbalah en lismoch alav. Or in English, we should not rely on any book not written by prophets or by the sages who transcribe tradition passed on to them. We only have
Rely on them in what sense?
You mean not rely on them? I think he meant do not even read them, and certainly don't use them, don't look into them. But look, Ibn Ezra himself, he never quotes in his entire commentary to the Bible, as far as I know, any of those books, even once. The Rashbam Rashi's grandson, also says, and was referring to certain legends in the beginning of Exodus. He says, "En davar ze b'divrei Tanaim ve'Amoraim." This does not appear anywhere in the books of the Tanaim and the Amoraim. Ve'ein lachush lasfarim hachitzoniyim, and no attention should be paid to apocryphal work. So these scholars were rejecting these books, but as I said, it was beyond rejecting. They were just not familiar with these texts altogether. So how were these books kept then? Wendy, I'm turning back to your question.
Okay.
So were these books kept? How did they survive?
To the Christians.
Exactly. So the answer is through Christianity. Because when Christians shaped their version of the Bible, and I'm not referring here to the New Testament, I'm referring to the Old Testament, to the Hebrew Bible, Christians did not follow the Masoretic text. They had a larger version of the Bible. And it makes a lot of sense because Christians relied on the Septuagint. They adopted the Septuagint as their form of the Bible, which was a larger canon. So they knew more stories or more, they were familiar or exposed to more biblical Jewish texts. Again, I'm not referring here to Christian compositions. I'm talking to hardcore Jewish texts that were just not accepted by most Jews for whatever reasons. So these books were just part of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament in the Christian church, but Jews are just not familiar with these books. In the medieval period, in rabbinic period, maybe they were familiar with them, but they rejected them. When it comes 1,000 years later, most Jews just don't know of these books altogether. Just think, how did they think about certain holidays, or how were they familiar with certain stories? They were not exposed to any of that. Yes, any question?
Professor,
Yes,
but
yes.
then we found most of them in the Qumran scrolls, right? And they were much before the Christianity, the New Testament.
Okay, so Qumran scrolls is a lot of these books is BCE, in other words, before Common Era, and we'll get to that part of the story later on at the end. But again, by the medieval period, rabbis are not familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls. They don't know anything of that. So these books existed in ancient Judaism, but they're not known anymore. When does the twist in this tale, when does it start? So in the 16th and 17th century, we start detecting changes in the story. Why 16th and 17th century? We're talking about a much later period in history when Jews and non-Jews start getting closer and closer. It's post-Renaissance period, and Jews and non-Jews become more and more exposed to each other's writings. On the one hand, Christians are interested in Jewish texts as part of what we called Hebraism, or the Christian interest in Jewish studies or in Jewish literature. They want to understand more. They want to widen their horizons about the Jewish context in which Christianity emerges. So Christians are interested in Jewish texts, but also Jews slowly become more and more familiar or exposed to such texts. The first important Jewish scholar that was actually surprised to learn or to discover that these texts exist is a scholar named Rabbi Azariah min ha'adumim, or in English, people refer to him as Azariah de Rossi. Did you hear this name before? He was a very famous, very good Italian scholar, and he has a very fascinating story. He wrote his most famous book is called Me'or Einayim. That's the name of his book. And in the beginning of the book, he tells us a very interesting story. In his city in Italy, in Mount Tua, there was an earthquake, and all the residents of the city need to escape and leave their homes and go out of town and wait until things become more clear. Everybody's out of the city, Jews and Christians together, and they start schmoozing and talking, having interesting conversations. And Rabbi Azariah approaches one non-Jew, and he tells him, you know what? Let's talk about our Bibles. And he realizes for the first time that Christians have a larger version of the Hebrew Bible. I'm not talking of the New Testament. I'm talking about the Jewish Hebrew Bible. And he's just shocked. I never knew that other people have a larger version of your Bible, of our Bible, right? How can Christians know more about the Bible than we Jews? And he starts investigating these books. He writes in his book, in one of the places, I'm reading in source number 3 in Hebrew first, and then we'll read it in English. אפשר לנו להוציא דבר יקר לאיזו מידה טובה או לימוד שכלי. I'll read it in English. Even from the Apocrypha, which might include many words of nonsense, it is nevertheless possible to derive something of value, whether correct conduct or intellectual knowledge. So he's surprised to hear there are additional texts that we were just not aware of. A few years later, another guy, Rabbi Gedalia ben Yichya, who writes one of the most important historical compositions of the 16th century called Shalshelet HaKabbalah, the change of tradition. And he also says, it is proper for you to know, I'm reading source number 1, that the Gentiles added other works in the collection of the Holy Scripture. And again, I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish part of the Bible, which are currently not in our possession. And I wish to present them so you become familiar with them. He's not going to tell you, let's turn them into part of our Bible. At least it's important for any knowledgeable person to be aware that such books exist. Rabbi David Gans, again, does anybody know this name? Rabbi David Gans, another important historian. Where is he buried? Does anybody know? It's not a trivia question. I'm sure you've been more times than me in the old cemetery in Prague, in the community in Prague. So that's where his grave is. Gans means goose or a duck of some sort. And on his grave, there's actually an illustration of a goose, because that was his last name. He wrote a book, another historical composition called Tzemach David. And in his book, he also says, he records all the names of all the books of the Apocrypha, the entire list that you saw in the earlier slide. And he says all the mentioned compositions, although of Jewish origin, nevertheless have been accepted by them and not by us. He wants us to be aware there are more books out there. Nevertheless, they're not part of our Jewish tradition. They didn't make it into the official version of the Bible. So what we see so far is the beginning of a change. If for many, many centuries, Jews are not aware of these books in the 16th and later on in the 17th centuries, people are starting to hear their additional biblical texts. But this is just the beginning of the story. In the end of the 18th, and mainly in the 19th century, an additional step takes place, or an addition that develops even further. Because what Jews are going to do, they're not going to be just happy with being aware of these books, but what are they going to do now? Any guesses? It's not just enough to know that these books exist. What will be the next step? So first, they're going to learn them thoroughly, but also they claim copyrights. They say, these are Jewish books. They belong to the Jews. They're not Christian compositions. There's no reason on earth that they should be considered part of the Christian literature and not Jewish books. These are Jewish texts. They belong to us. But how can they show that they belong to Jews? How can they actually make it clear that these are Jewish compositions and not non-Jewish texts? So they do something very interesting. And here we need to remember something very important. In the course of history, since Jews did not keep these books, did not consider them part of their tradition, they were not known in their original language. They were only known through translations. So Christians knew these books either in Latin or in Greek, but the original Hebrew was lost by now. The original text of these books was not available anymore. It was just gone. Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Bible. So if Christians read the Bible in Greek, so they learned about these additional books, but they didn't see them in the original language. And most of these books were composed originally in Hebrew. The Hebrew was lost by now. So what are Jews going to do now?
Are they going to write them in Hebrew?
So they're going to write them in Hebrew. I would say they try to retranslate them back the other way around. If they were initially in Hebrew, they were translated into Greek, Latin, and many other languages.
Yeah.
So Jews are trying to reconstruct what they would have sounded like in Hebrew. I think this is really a fascinating thing because it tells us a lot about the world of these Jews. On the one hand, they have this patriotic feelings that they need to make these books Hebrew. They believe in the value of the Hebrew language. But I think at the same time, what they're trying to say, we contributed a very significant body of literature to the entire world. And we want people to acknowledge that. So they want to turn these into Jewish books, but they also want everybody else to know that this is our tradition. So starting from the end of the 18th century, what you will see is translations back into Hebrew of many of the Apocrypha's texts. The first translation was done by Naftali Herz Vesely. We've mentioned him in the previous session, a colleague of Moses Mendelssohn, and he translates a book called The Wisdom of Solomon, or in Hebrew it's called Hokhmat Yisrael. In the Masoretic text, we have Kohelet, Shir HaShirim, and Mishlei that are attributed to King Solomon. But there was an additional text called The Wisdom of Solomon, part of the Apocrypha, that was not known to Jews for centuries. It appears rarely in Jewish literature beforehand. Naftali Herz Vesely decides he will translate this book back into Hebrew. Side point, I'm telling you now, scholars today are not convinced it ever existed in Hebrew to begin with, but it was certainly a Jewish book, and he translates this book back into Hebrew. Sefer Hokhmat Yisrael. This is the original front page of the book. It was done in 1780. A few years later,
any of the books
yes,
in original Hebrew.
He's putting it in what he thinks.
Have they ever found in the time since he was translated?
We'll talk about this. We're moving on in history, so you'll have to wait patiently.
Okay.
You're asking great questions, but you have to wait. Okay, so this is the first step. A few years later, another Jewish maskil, enlightened Jew scholar, his name was Judah Leib ben Ze'ev, a very important scholar. He was mainly interested in the Hebrew grammar, but also in other fields. He decides to translate two other books. First, he translates the book of Ben Sirah, a very important part of the Apocrypha. We're not going to talk about the history of this book. It are books that resembles Proverbs or books and words of wisdom, I would say. So he translates this book, again, from the existing Greek or Latin back into Hebrew. And he even adds a German translation to this text. And you can see here on this page that using Ben Ze'ev's translation, it was also translated a little bit later into Spanish and into another Hebrew translation. So it becomes a popular Jewish book in Jewish communities. It even translates back into Yiddish, because all these Jews are trying to make a point. These are Jewish books. We need to bring them back home. It's not going to remain in Greek or in Latin. It will become back and become a Jewish Hebrew book. Look at this one. Look at this guy. This is a guy named Isaac Frankel, Yitzhak Zekel Frankel. In 1830 in Leipzig, he produces the entire corpus of all the Apocrypha, almost the entire corpus. You see, this is the front page, and it's called in Hebrew. Can you read this book? Yeah, what does it say there? Apocrypha, in Hebrew letters. Apocrypha meaning, by the way, the word Apocrypha means the hidden books, or the books that were put aside. So he puts an edition of the Apocrypha, and look what he says below. Ktuvim achronim, or later texts, hanodaim b'shem Apocrypha, otherwise known as Apocrypha, asher lo nod'u liYisrael miyimei hikatvam ad hayom hazeh, that were not known to Jews from the very beginning of history until this point. I love his introduction. Let's look together at the introduction of this book. I hope you'll find this fascinating as I do. In the introduction, he doesn't bring his own words. He's letting the book speak for himself. And look what he says. It's presented in the form of a poem. And maybe one of you will want to help me read it. If not, I'll need to read this, translate it for you. You see how it appears. This is the introduction of the book. And it reads, Vayisa hasefer hazeh et meshalo vayomar. The book is going to say the following words. Anybody wants to try?
I was a desire.
Yes, David. We'll interrupt you every second. Okay, so don't take it personally.
I was a desired son to my parents, and they loved me. Oh, the grave consumed them. I am now all alone. My acquaintances distanced themselves and abandoned me. Every brother and companion left me. I remained on my own. So clearly, someone has chosen to create these rhymes. All by myself, I was wandering in cities and towns. I grew gray and old from my travels. Had it not been that alien children took me in, I would have been dead by now. To them I narrated the deeds of my forefathers and what God worked through them. It was they who believed the truth of my testimony and recorded them in books for them to survive. There I stayed long days and years because they favored my teaching even better than wine. Embarrassingly, I was waiting for my own people, but they despised me with an arrogant eye.
Okay, this is not, by the way, this is not my translation. I had a friend of mine who helped me out. This is just the beginning. So who's speaking here? It's the books themselves.
Books, yeah.
And what are they saying? Their acquaintances distanced away themselves from these books, referring to who?
The Jews.
The Jews. But if it was not for alien children who took me in, who are those alien children?
Christians.
Christians, right? Christians were able to take these books. And if it wasn't for them, we would have been dead by now. But nevertheless, the book is complaining. I'm waiting and waiting and waiting for you Jews to take me back home, to bring me back home, to include me back as part of your tradition. You have to continue, David. Thank you for helping us out with this. This is the second part. My brothers.
My brothers, why shall I be buried in foreign soil? Are there lies in my mouth or falsehood on my tongue? Why do you hate me like an intoxicated man? Let me know what my guilt is and what is my sin. Do you not fear sinning with your own blood, alienating the testimony of your forefathers, ascribing fault to your mother's son, dismissing faithful words as lies? Do see, I just escaped like a deer from a trap because my feelings have stirred up concerning my people. I have crept further, but feared to approach, lest you turn your back to me and I will be lost. Return, my companions. Honor the memory of my forefathers, for only the great deeds of God and his praise is on my lips.
Okay, so the book here is talking about the new developments. And you see, it says, I just escaped like a deer from a trap. How did he escape? How did the book escape from the trap?
Some Jews read the Septuagint,
They read it, and beyond that, the book was now translated back into Hebrew. And he's just begging for everybody, return my companions, honor the memory. Or in other words, purchase the book, get a copy, bring it home, include me as part of your, put it on your Jewish bookshelf. I'm part of your Jewish tradition. So you see the book is begging for people to include them back. This is a fascinating story, and I think just this tells a lot about the nature of what's going on in the 19th century. Look, Jews are becoming exposed to books that they never heard of before. Throughout the 19th century, here I'm just going to go through a few slides. You will see many Jews, sometimes not being aware of their fellow Jews, are coming up with more and more translations, sometimes of the same books over and over again back into Hebrew. This is in Berlin, 1833, another composition called Nozlim in Lebanon. Again, including the entire Apocrypha back into Hebrew. He tells in the introduction that he didn't know that somebody did it 3 years before. But he nevertheless decided to publish the book. And a few years later, you see in Warsaw, somebody's putting the book of Judith, another one of these books. And you can find maybe 30, 40 additional editions of these books all over Europe. Hebrew translations of the Apocrypha. These are fascinating texts. This is the book of Judith that had a slightly better luck in the medieval period. People heard a little bit about it because some communities read it on Hanukkah, but that's a separate story. So this is the book of Judith, and he also translated Ben Sirah in the book of Tobias and many, many other compositions. So by the end of the 19th century, we could even see that certain books have numerous Hebrew translations. This is you see one example. This is a verse from Ben Sirah. I give you here the English translation. Just imagine this appeared in Greek or in Latin. And this is what it would sound like. Who wants to read? The poor man's wisdom. Yes.
Do you want me to read?
Yeah, just to get a sense of this text, and then you'll see how people are trying to make up the Hebrew.
Okay. The poor man's wisdom lifts his head high and sets him among princes. Continue.
Go on.
Okay. 2. Do not praise a man for his looks. Do not despise an an ugly man for his appearance. And 3, least is the bee among winged things, but she reaps the choicest of all harvests.
So just imagine this is a verse from Ben Sirah, and all these Jews are trying to think, what would this sound like in Hebrew? So here we have 3 options. This guy reads it in the following way. This is from one version. Hokhmat misken tarim rosho v'nedivim toshivenu al tehalel ish betoar panav velo tavoz adam ki moshchat mar'eu. Just to get a sense of the sounds. I'm not trying to go through word by word. Kima sha'ot ba'of hadvora u'ma matok piria. This is one idea, one attempt. The other one is this one. Look, another guy. This is an interesting guy from Vilna. I didn't mention him before. A Jew from Vilna in 1817 and later in 1842 produces another Hebrew translation of Ben Sirah, and this is what he reads: "HaChokhma mevi'a et hanikle uvuz mishpachot lekavod gadol," and so on. A different version. The third one. This is the guy that we read his introduction. He has his own take. He has a different version of the Hebrew. So each one comes up with his own speculative. What did the Hebrew sound like? This is the story of the 19th century. And now we just need to wait for here you see a chart where you can see I just referred to the 3rd verse there. You see each one comes up with something entirely different, but they share one goal: to come up with this original Hebrew, to guess what the Hebrew sounded like, and to make these back into Jewish books. So what's the happy end? Question mark. The happy end takes place in the year 1898. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Solomon chapter in the Geniza.
Geniza?
Right, the Geniza is found. And for
Yeah.
the first
I
time,
found
what
that
do
to be
Jews
really
find out?
Yeah.
Why is that such a significant discovery?
Because these were old texts from the people in the Egyptian area that were buried for thousands of years.
But with regards to the Apocrypha, why is this so significant?
Because
after thousands of years,
the original Apocrypha.
right, the original books in the original, right, the original book in the original language was found or was discovered for the first time. After thousands of years, the Jews are not familiar with these texts. It will happen again in the 1950s when the Dead Sea Scrolls are found. More books will be found, but again, only fragments. Ben Sirah is the only book where we have major copies, both from the Cairo Geniza and from the Dead Sea. Most of these books, we will just have tiny fragments, but they clarify, they reinforce this Jewish feeling. These are actually Jewish books. The Book of Jubilees, for instance, if you heard, some fragments of that book were found in Qumran. Some of the testaments of the 12 tribes, and all these books. Is that a happy end?
Well, there's still going to be lots of arguments.
Okay, it should be a very happy end, but there are some people who are very upset. Do you want to guess who are those people?
Yeah.
Who was very upset with this?
Traditionalists?
Not traditionalists. They are upset about the Apocrypha in general. But just think
Christians?
about all of these translators. For centuries, people are translating these books. They're spending their entire lives guessing what the Hebrew might have sounded like. And now the original text is found, and they can tell who was right and who got it totally wrong, who was close and who was just far off. It was not a big celebration for these people. Here you see the same text from the Cairo Geniza. You see with the frame here on the side. This is what it looks like in the context of the entire page. And these are the actual lines of the text we read. So you see the original Hebrew was found. And this is just one sample. Obviously, the entire book was found. Here you can see the comparison between all those 4 versions. We have Ben Ze'ev, Isaac Frankel, Hazel, which is the guy from Vilna. And finally, you see the real thing that was found in the Geniza. It was such a tragic end for these people that, as a matter of fact, if you look into early 19th century newspapers, you will see that some of them just couldn't let go of their translations. They felt our translations just sound so much better than the original Hebrew. And they even suspected that that the original texts that were found in the Cairo Geniza are not the original text. I'll show you one example. This is a letter I found in 1937. David, you're reading, so I'll give you one more text. This is a nice one. This is a scholar who's trying to talk about the discovery of Shechter that you mentioned a second ago, of the Ben Sirah fragment. And look what he says.
It is hard to believe that the worn fragments found by Professor Shechter in the Geniza in Cairo are indeed the original Hebrew source of Ben Sirah for several reasons. It is inconceivable that the greatest scholar of his day, Yoshua the son of Sirah, was such a poor Hebrew rhetoric and could not express his wisdom in pure and fluent Hebrew, but rather in a corrupt style, employing uncommon words. They appear to be a literal translation from Greek by some inexperienced translator and at variance with the original Hebrew source.
So you get a sense here. If there was still doubts after the same texts were discovered in the Dead Sea, it became very clear. This is indeed the original Hebrew, even if there's slight variations, but the original book was found. What we've done so far, I'm trying to summarize, is to tell you just one story of many, many stories that take place in the 19th century. And the main theme that I'm trying to talk about, or the main point I'm trying to make, eyes are suddenly starting to open up, and they realize that the Jewish tradition is much more than they were familiar with. This is just one text, or one corpus of texts, biblical texts. But when you move further later on, you find Philo. People discovered the writings of Philo in the 16th century. The letters of the work of Josephus that was not known for centuries. They learn about new translations of the Bible. Suddenly people's familiarity with more and more texts are growing. They're becoming exposed to the Christian academic world, and everything starts becoming much more large and complicated, many more sounds and many more voices. Now it's 9 o'clock, my time. I will be happy to continue for 3 more minutes just to make up for the minutes we've missed, unless you want to stop
it's
now.
completely fine. It's completely fine with me. We do have a couple questions also, so if we can leave time for
okay.
that as well. Yeah, but
Okay,
it's completely fine with me.
Okay, and if anybody wants to leave, I'm not gonna, you can just close your camera and leave, it's fine. I just want to mention at least, or address. So on the one hand, this is a nice story because it tells us how Jews are enlarging their library and are learning more and more about the Jewish tradition. But at the same time, this was also a great challenge for Jews, because when you open up the Apocrypha or Philo or Josephus, suddenly you hear alternative traditions to the ones that we're familiar with in rabbinic literature in many, many realms. Just one example, in Book of Jubilees, one of the Suda Epigrapha texts, meaning one of the books that were not included in the Bible, in the Jewish version of the Masoretic text, but nevertheless was part of the Bible, we have an alternative calendar that doesn't follow the solar system, that follows the solar system. What do we do with that? We used to think that Jews have one type of calendar, but now we see that alternative calendars. People open up the works of Josephus and they read alternative halachot, or interpretations to Jewish law, different than the ones that appear in the Mishnah or in the Talmud, and even earlier ones. And this is true with regards to ancient translations or ancient, many type of compositions, and not just within rabbinic literature. How did Jews deal with such things? So here it's very much dependent on their ideology. And here we're talking about the ideological component. Liberal Jews who are interested in changing or allowing or introducing changes in Jewish law are very happy with this, because they can show Judaism was never one thing. It always enabled including many versions or types. There are many sects and groups and sounds. So it's fine to include more than one type of Judaism. It was more complicated for more conservative Jews, Orthodox or conservative Jews, who did not really, were not really eager to learn that there are alternative traditions, legal traditions. And here we see that there are debates going on. If we had more time, we're going to end soon, but I included in this presentation one legal example, but again, the idea repeats itself again and again in more or less similar lines. Orthodox people are threatened by this. They need to explain how come we find alternative traditions, and very often they would say, look, this is precisely the reason why these compositions were left out. This is precisely why we were not they were not familiar for so many centuries because we rejected those. More liberal scholars will be more willing or even interested in learning about these compositions, learning about them. And this becomes a very important component of modern Jewish studies. Okay, so now I'm going to answer questions if you have any. You want to tell me what did I miss?
Sure. There is a question from Chaya. Is the Apocrypha, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong,
Yeah, Apocrypha.
Included in Christian Bibles today?
So it depends. Protestants rejected these books again in the 16th century because they were turning back to the Masoretic text in many other ways as well. That was part of what they perceived as the original Hebrew Bible. And Protestants were going back to that form of the Bible. So they would also follow a narrow version of the Bible, and they will include, they don't dismiss these books. So they accept the fact, they acknowledge the existence of these books, but they will not consider them as part of the hardcore Bible. Catholics still include them as part of their Bibles, yes. So it's a matter of debate even among Christians. Okay, other questions?
Did Orthodox or traditional commentators look at this and say something of the sort of that these books existed, but clearly were in error in some way, and therefore not includable, that God determined that they should be left by the wayside, shall we say?
So I imagine that some people would say what you're saying. They would probably claim either it was for a good reason they were rejected, or that in some form of evolutionary process, Judaism left them out. But look, now they're being rediscovered. So once you discover the same books again, the question comes up, why did God want these books to become known again then? It's always hard to try to think through what God has in mind, because you never know how things will develop. But you could say, look, traditional Jews will say probably more, traditional law was based upon certain texts, and it might be interesting to broaden our horizons and understand what the rabbis were dealing with, or what alternative laws they were trying to reject. But at the same time, we don't have to follow that. But I think today's scholars, and even Orthodox scholars, are much more open-minded to reading these things and just becoming familiar with alternative traditions.
I mean, they don't seem to be texts which are challenging Chumash so much as they're different historical or stories from after.
No, it's not true. Part of the Apocrypha is parallel, or the Apocrypha also includes books that are parallel to the Torah.
Oh,
for instance,
okay.
the Book of Jubilees.
I've never read them, so I mean, all of them, so that I don't know that. Yeah.
So the Jubilees is one example. It's a parallel text that runs parallel to the Book of Genesis up to the story of Matan Torah. You have the Testament of the 12 tribes, which is an amazing composition in which each one of the 12 tribes tells his own autobiography before he dies. So you kind of find here a form of ancient interpretation to the stories of Genesis. I always recommend to my students that in Israel, I tell them, if you want to read an interesting interpretation to the Parshat Shavua as you read the Chumash, you can always take one of these books, because these are the most ancient Jewish interpretations to the Bible that exist anywhere on this planet. I'm talking about hundreds of years before rabbinic literature, before the Mishnah and Talmud. So you can read this, again, you don't have to view them as some divine texts, but at least you can view them as a type of interpretation. These are the most ancient interpretations of the Hebrew Bible composed by Jews ever. I mean, if you don't include biblical's own interpretation, intertextual interpretations, so this is the most ancient form of interpretation. It's a fascinating source. Yes, Judy, I see you want to ask something.
Yeah.
Yes, Judy.
In the beginning, you cited the sources like Rabbi Akiva saying specifically not to go outside the 24 known books, and that in some way led to their loss. Is that argument never used as the reason not to turn to these books?
Look, I'm sure you're right that some people will still refrain from looking at these books based on Rabbi Akiva, although Rabbi Akiva doesn't really specify which books he's referring to. He just says if you read, if you look into Sfarim Chitzonim, external books, but he doesn't really specify what he's referring to. A side point, since you asked that, he says that you don't have a share in the world to come. It's probably also a pun on the verse in Kohelet where it says Asot Sfarim Harbe En Ketz. If you read these books, you will not have a ketz, not endless books, but you will not have an end, or you will not have a share in the world to come. But look, I feel today there's so much literature to read, and people read such garbage, if I may say. I wish my kids will spend all their times reading Jubilees and read Ben Sira and not read the type of junk they're reading, you know? So I think, you know, back in Rabbi Akiva's ages, what did people have to read? It was only, you know, certain texts that were maybe a threat. But nowadays, I think really things changed drastically. So, but obviously some people will not read.
No, I was just wondering if that's used as a traditional opposition.
Look, I think that the people who already heard about these books read them. If you ask me in the Mir Yeshiva, do people read these books? They don't read them. But again, they'd never heard of these books. So it's not even a question for them.
They still haven't heard of it.
Probably most people didn't hear of these books. And the ones who hear about them are the curious ones. And they probably are going to go and look at them. Even just for the fact that it's forbidden. So they need to know what's not allowed to be read.
Of course.
What are you not allowed to read?
Okay. But it's not officially on the table.
Yeah, right. But this is, again, just one story, but just think each one of the books that was found, Philo, Josephus, each one is more or less the same tale. There are different names and different people who discovered these texts, but it repeats itself because people discover there's a lot more out there. Okay, we'll meet you next week. I'm very sorry for the technical aspects that didn't work out at the beginning, but I hope at least you managed to follow and get something.
I have another question. You have these you have these wonderful outlines of your whole shiur. They really give it such a great structure. Is it possible for us to get that outline, a copy of your outline?
Okay, so I'll speak to the office and I'll see how they can give them to you.
Okay. It would be a great summary of the whole.
Yeah. Okay. I'm happy to. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Gafni, this was so interesting and so wonderful. And despite some of the technology problems, I think it was a fabulous.
I just hope that you managed to hear me. I'm starting to think, did you hear 90%, 80% of what I said, 50%?
We heard it, and you know, it was so interesting and really enjoyable. I'm really looking forward to next time. And thank you also to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We are going to continue our fall programming this evening at 8 p.m. with the fourth part of a multi-part series by Rabbi David Silber on imagining King David in the Babylonian Talmud. In addition to this class, we have many classes happening right now. You can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes. or watch live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again, Dr. Gafni, for this opportunity to learn with you. And thanks again to everyone who attended. I'm sorry for some of the tech issues. We hope to see you soon at one of our upcoming classes at Drisha.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.